Don't use Cure 1, noob! Ice Mage bad! Here's a link to a website explaining why Cure 1 is bad. Oh my god, use defensives! You're doing it wrong! 2 relatively common problems I hear about from other players related to dealing with other, worse players, let's put it like that, is that 1. They won't listen to my advice. And 2. You can't teach anyone anything without risking getting reported. Obviously, there will always be players that simply refuse to listen to advice or just don't want it. And there will always be players so aggressively hostile towards any comment they might try to report anyone for as much as looking their way. However, getting reported is one thing, getting punished is another, and often relates to whether what you actually did can be considered offensive. In the same way, a lot of the time when others refuse to listen, it can be because your opening statement to get them to listen puts them on the back foot and on the defensive. As a matter of fact, my jokingly bringing up those 5 quotes right at the start might already have put some of you in a defensive position because you think saying those things to someone else is completely reasonable. However, sometimes, as the listener, you have to choose between whether you want to defend your perspective or stand to learn something new, and sometimes, as the speaker, you have to choose between whether you want to dunk on that other person, whether you want them to know that you're right, or whether you want them to learn something new. And sometimes, you simply cannot do both. There may even be times where it is better to simply let the other player be wrong, as the best way for them to eventually learn how to be right is to be allowed to be wrong. Let's talk about these things. The specific subjects I want to talk about are as follows. Why is it a problem to tell someone what they're doing is bad? How can good intentions be so misinterpreted when telling someone how to do better on a whim? Is there a better way to approach this? How much advice should you give? And finally, is it always good to approach it at all? I hope these subjects will help you to be better able to teach your fellow players in a way where they receive your advice instead of tossing it aside. And I don't care whether you will use this power to actually legitimately teach other players, or use it for your own ends to make sure the players you end up with don't suck as much, or whatever you want to call it. Let's start with, why is it a problem to tell someone what they're doing is bad? Years ago, a typical way I would go about teaching another player in Final Fantasy XIV would be to intentionally catch them in a situation where what they were doing, which was wrong, caused them to fail, or I had the ability to highlight it being bad. I did this because I believed showcasing to them what they were doing was bad would make them more willing to listen to my advice, as I could make them better. While it sometimes worked, more likely with players that were more lenient with me and were more interested in learning than being offended. Other times, it would rather hurt the player I wanted to help, or they'd be offended, or they would get too caught up in defending what they were doing, whatever it takes. This means they get so caught up in defending their position that they have no time or space to hear what I have to say. And giving my advice a chance is to them the same as admitting that they were wrong in front of me, someone they now might not like, and might not want to see succeed at teaching them. They would rather defiantly continue to play wrong to hurt me than improve. To put it a different way, pointing to what the other player is doing and saying that it is wrong puts the focus of the conversation on that. And given they are doing it with a good reason, surely, they will almost certainly take it personally if you say what they're doing, and have been doing, possibly for a long time depending on their level with the job, is wrong. I am no psychologist, but essentially attacking someone else's beliefs, in this case what they believe is the right way to play, puts their brain into fight mode, and they're now harder to convince as a result. But if the thing they're doing is absolutely definitely bad, why can't I tell them that? If you tell that white mage to stop using Cure 1, which they have been doing for ages potentially, they will already be moving to come up with a reason why they do it, and they will have a much easier time convincing themselves that it is the right thing to do, because they're not looking for a good reason. They're looking for a figurative mallet to smack back at you with. If you instead focus on what they can do better before you start, you can sometimes redirect their attention. It can be easier to convince someone that Cure 2 is better to use if you start them off by thinking about why they're not using Cure 2, rather than starting them off with why they are using Cure 1, because they are almost certainly a lot more acquainted with their reason for using Cure 1 than their reason not to use Cure 2. This can be expanded to any job with some weird common issue. For example, a black mage mainly or exclusively using ice magic often has a specific reason for it, and if you start off by bashing them for using ice magic, they will be ready to defend it, because asking them why they are using ice magic almost sounds accusatory right out the gate, whereas asking them why they're not using fire magic, while it can also sound accusatory, may also sound more curious. One sounds like, why are you doing this thing that is bad? While the other, at least sometimes, can sound like, why are you not doing this thing that might be good too? One causes the ice mage to defend their choice, the other might give a similar response. Both might be, I like ice magic better. But the one explaining why they don't use fire magic might be positioned more as a friendly explanation for their preference. I know it sounds confusing, but the trick is in figuring out a way to sneak past some figurative brain defenses here. And speaking of brain defenses, how can good intentions be so misinterpreted when telling someone how to do better on a whim? Telling someone else what to do without asking permission can be interpreted as commanding them to play in a specific way. From the position of, what I'm telling them is definitely optimal and good, so why is that a bad thing? It can be difficult to understand why that can be a problem in the first place. However, if you replaced your actually good advice with advice from someone else who genuinely believes they are in the right, just like you, but they're not, unlike you, hopefully, the exact same kind of position can be a huge problem. There are players that have many hundreds, if not thousands of hours in Final Fantasy XIV that legitimately believe that healers should never attack, because it is both a waste of MP and, according to them, healers do basically no damage anyway. Both false, by the way. How would you feel as an accomplished, experienced healer if some rando told you to stop attacking and conserve your MP, use Cure 1 more, it is cheaper, and so on? Probably offended. The weird thing is that they're also, essentially, commanding you to play in a specific way. The only difference is that you don't agree with the way they want you to play. Of course, wording is important, but sometimes this kind of commanding choice of words, use this specifically, don't use that, can be actually interpreted as harassment, especially if you repeat it over and over. A somewhat recent thing players have started doing when they see healers that use their basic heal, whether it is Cure 1, Benefic 1, Diagnosis, or Physic, is to direct them to the website stopusingcure1.info. Yes, that is the name. It is a website that in reasonably good detail explains exactly why Cure 1 is considered bad to use once better options are unlocked, but also applies indirectly to other healers and their similar options. The website even has a page dedicated to explaining that it isn't meant to criticize the individual who did use Cure 1. Overall, it is a great website for this specific purpose, but there is one problem with just sending this to players. If you just sent this link outright, with little or minimal explanation beforehand, the one you're trying to help might not follow the link. Random link from a stranger on the internet, anyone? And if they don't, all they read is stop using Cure 1, which does seem to criticize them, and also sounds like a command. So before they have even considered opening the link, they're on the back foot and possibly on the defensive. So, is there a better way to approach this? Sometimes. I personally use 3 openers to approach players that make some sort of common mistake that I want to help correct. When it is something relatively simple and specific, I start with, you would do even better if you did so and so when this and that. I've used this one in cases with tanks and low-level content not using AoE, or they are using AoE, even pulling big but not using defensive cooldowns well. Sometimes, in these cases, giving the player a mostly correct tip in the pursuit of simplifying it more can be better, as it lets them incorporate it into their toolkit better, and then they can always make it better later. I've done this a few times in mentor roulettes a while back actually, so to give a specific example, you would do even better if you used total eclipse when there are at least 2 enemies in range. The logic of phrasing it like this is that by indicating they would do even better, you indirectly point out that what they are doing is already good, but it can be improved upon. This is intended to avoid putting them on the defensive and wanting to defend using single target only or something like that. The second opener I use is even simpler, and usually applies to players where I get the impression that they're doing what they're doing because they simply don't know what to do. Can I give you a tip? Or can I give you some advice? Sometimes best presented with a smiley. This also saves you a ton of effort, you see? Because if they say no, then even if you had tried to command them to do something or sent them the stopusingcure1.info link, they would not receive it. They don't care and they don't want it, so save your breath. If, on the other hand, they say yes, then you have the floor to give them advice, with a reasonable high probability that they will actually hear you out. Furthermore, now that they have agreed to receive your advice, you're no longer giving off that same commanding voice when you tell them to do X and not Y, although you could easily turn back around and end up doing that depending on how you word your advice. The third opener I tend to use with higher level players, or players that seem to be doing something so specific that I can't imagine they don't have a reason up their sleeve for it. Why are you doing X? Or why are you not doing Y? This may sound familiar with the Ice Mage example from earlier, and indeed, you have to be careful with this wording, because if you ask them why they do a thing that they likely have been asked a million times before, they will get defensive. If you manage to phrase it so you can focus on the benefits of doing what they're not doing, that can often help a lot more. They might explain why they're doing what they're doing, which might give you an avenue to approach it in a friendly way. The difficulty here is that with players this far down a rabbit hole, you often cannot fix the entire problem in that one duty, if you can fix it at all. The important part is to attempt to approach teaching the other player by asking them either for permission to help them or get them to join the conversation with you on equal terms. Which then leads us to, how much advice should you give? Each case is of course unique, and there can be nuances, but my general advice is to focus on one thing. If you run into someone playing a job completely wrong, you cannot teach them how to play the whole job from start to finish in this one sitting. They will simply be overwhelmed and retain nothing, or stop listening in the first place. However, if you focus on one thing and focus on the importance of that one thing, while they learned less things, and might still be totally off, they at least learned one thing for certain. For example, if I have a tank in a low-level dungeon that was both not using AoE and also not using defensives, I would focus on teaching them about AoE first, and then next time I meet them, or a different mentor meets them, they can take the conversation about defensives. This also comes with the benefit of making it easier for them to incorporate that one thing you taught them in the specific duty, and then having a success doing it so they'll continue to do it. Hopefully. This can also apply to difficult duties. With casual difficulty duties, I recommend either saying nothing and letting players fail and then talk about the things that go wrong, or alternatively, talk about the one most problematic mechanic in the fight and nothing more. For extremes that you can meet as a mentor, for instance, explaining the whole fight can sometimes be a good thing, but it highly depends on the listeners, and most of the time, explaining the key mechanics, the ones that must be done in a certain way, is better, because, again, it emphasizes the importance of that mechanic. If you explain every single mechanic in the fight, then you give equal amounts of ground to the fact the boss opens with a raid wide to the crucial boss mechanic that must be done in a certain way, and the listeners might just not retain that. Which leads us finally to, is it always good to approach it at all? To truly learn how to intuitively learn game mechanics, you sometimes need to be allowed to figure it out yourself. That doesn't mean that every player must learn everything on their own. But what it does mean is that each time you explain the mechanic for them before they even get to see it, you rob them of the opportunity to figure it out themselves. Each time you explain how to use a specific action for them, you rob them of the opportunity to figure out how to do it on their own. This is also why it is often a good idea to let the other players fail first before you explain it. Sometimes letting them fail multiple times even. You could even ask them if they would like to guess how a mechanic works in those cases. The weirdest part to this is that if you see a player that is clearly doing something wrong, but they're not repeatedly making the same mistake, you might be observing that they are trying things. They're figuring it out. Then just supporting them in the fight and letting them continue to learn on their own is often a great move. Sometimes I've said in my mentor roulette videos that it seems like a player in my group just needs a win, so to speak. A way to teach a tank that they don't have to face plant on every defensive the moment combat starts is to let them carefully try with very little, perhaps even no defensive cooldowns, so they can see how much of a difference each thing makes. As long as they are clearly learning something, you might not have to say a thing. So in summary, if your aim is to help someone learn something, do not open with telling them they're bad. Do open by asking why they're doing what they're doing, or asking if you could give them advice. Focus on helping them with one big important thing. Don't try to teach them the entire universe all at once. It won't stick anyway. And remember, sometimes saying nothing and just supporting them can also be enough for them to figure it out themselves. And if there was one thing to take away from this video, I would say the following. Swallow your pride. It is more important they learn something than it is that you're right and they're wrong. But what do you think? Do you have advice for how to approach teaching other players certain things? Are there specific tips and advice you end up giving often that seems to land well? Please do let me know about them in the comments. And consider also checking out that stopusingcure1.info website made by Major Props. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Stormblood, Paladins never learned an AoE attack and simply held AoE enmity with Flash, which just applied enmity and no damage. It also blinded the enemies, if possible. They did have Circle of Scorn though. Before Shadowbringers, Total Eclipse wasn't learned until level 46.